Okay, thank you everybody and welcome to today's Dóchas Ethical Communications workshop. This is workshop number 2. As many of you will be aware, we had our first one in July with Jess Crombie. So we're delighted to have Emer O'Neill and Dr. Eben Joseph here with us today, along with Sarah Hegarty from Concern, who's going to moderate. Just a couple of housekeeping issues for me before we get underway. So as you will have heard just there, we are recording the session, and it will very soon after we finish the meeting, it will go up onto the webpage, the Ethical Communications webpage, along with the previous workshop and the actual the new guide itself, which hopefully many of you are now familiar with, which we launched back in May. So this is the second workshop. Again, next year we aim to replicate the workshops with a couple more and just keep the conversation going around ethical communications. So for now, I'm going to stop talking, and before I introduce Sarah, I'm going to just quickly ask our CEO, Jana McKenna, to say a few words and welcome everybody. Thanks, Jana.
Thanks, Ronan. So firstly, I'd just like to welcome everyone to this webinar. It's great to see such a high level of interest and participation, and I know the numbers are continuing to grow in terms of people coming into the room, which is fantastic to see. And I really would like to extend a very warm welcome to both Emer O'Neill and Dr. Eben Joseph. It's brilliant to have them here, and it really goes to the core of what we're trying to do with the Ethical Communications Guide and with the workshops. It's really around bringing in new perspectives, different perspectives, and actually trying to really see how we can overcome some of the challenges that we may have in applying the guide of ethical communications, and seeing how we need to perhaps look at our own communications and what we need to adjust, change, or review. And it's really around having a conversation, having a discussion, and having a safe space to discuss some of those challenges, some of the opportunities as well, but really to bring in different expertise and perspectives into the conversation and broaden our own insight into some of the issues around ethical communications today. I'm delighted that we have the Director of Communications, Sarah Hegarty, here to facilitate this conversation. And as Ronan said, we hope to have to continue a series of workshops into 2024. So there's a lot happening in this space, and it's great to see such an interest from our membership on it. But with that, I will hand over to Sarah, and I hope you all have a great session today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jana, and thanks, Ronan. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see lots of familiar faces. I'm here this morning to moderate this important discussion on the impact of the images and messages that our sector uses on those in Ireland with diverse backgrounds. As Ronan said, this is the second webinar on this topic, and marks the publication of Dóchas' Guide to Ethical Communications. But I also think it's very timely given the recent horrific events in Dublin city centre, so very timely. We'll be hearing shortly from our 2 expert panellists, and then after that we'll go into breakout rooms to get your reactions. We'll feedback in the wider forum, and there'll also be an opportunity to ask questions. So you can put questions in the chat or you can raise a hand. So we're joined by 2 amazing panelists who I'm delighted to introduce. Dr. Eben Joseph is a diversity and race relations consultant. She's an author, a TV panelist, a lecturer in Black Studies at UCD, director of the Institute of Anti-Racism and Black Studies, and the founder of the African Scholar Association Ireland. And that's just about half of her CV. She's an extremely accomplished individual. Emer O'Neill, many of you will recognise Emer from her frequent appearances in the media. Emer is currently Global Citizenship Education Officer with the Irish Girl Guides. She's a writer and an anti-racism activist. If you haven't already seen her excellent TED Talk on challenging racism and unconscious bias, definitely take some time to look at that. Emer has also written an anti-racism policy for schools, which we hope will be enacted sometime soon. She's presented on RT's Homeschool Hub and on the Today Show on RT1, and she's also very busy with 3 young children. So delighted to have them both here today. Before we go into the detail on the topic of our sector's images and messaging, Evan, let's look at the context. Racism is not something new in Ireland, and I know the historic background is complex, but Evan, could you give us some context as to how we have arrived at where we are now? Oh, you're on mute.
Just to say good morning to everyone, and a really big thank you for inviting myself and Emma here to have this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to a productive conversation, not just us talking at you, but exchange of ideas and, that's how we grow. But, to come to the whole idea of, racism, in Ireland, I think, we look at, that racism is how do we define racism? I have a really short definition of racism, right? I said that racism is treating people differently, negatively on the basis of their race. So when you treat somebody negatively just because of their race, not because of anything they've done, said, or anything, that, even before they open their mouth, they are treated negatively. That is what racism is, because of their race. So it's not another form of bullying, or, we try and call it all kinds of things. No, it is treating them differently, negatively, because of their race. And we see that, race, you can choose your ethnicity, you cannot choose your race. So those are key things that we know about race. I can have 3 ethnicities, I only have 1 race. I don't even choose my race. People look at you and they decide this is your race. So if I came on this call now and I say, look, I'm white, everybody say, no, she's mad. So you see, that means that I can't choose my race. But I can come here, I can say I'm Irish, I'm Nigerian, I'm Spanish, I'm Polish. I can choose my ethnicity. I cannot choose my race. So you're born with 1 race, you die with that race all the way through your life. It doesn't change. But there are key things we say about race. We say that race is socially constructed. What it means is that race is not biology. In other words, between 2 Black people or 2 white people, there is more difference within the group than across. So from a Black person to a white person, there is more difference biologically than within a Black group or a white group. So there's more difference, across the group than within the group. So it's socially constructed because, I'll take Ima as an example. So in Ireland, Ima is called mixed race, right? We call her Black as well, but she's more in our record, in our sense of seen as mixed race. In the United States, she'll be called Black. In South Africa, she'll be called white. Do you see? So this is the same person. And on this same day, if I take her to these 3 locations, the way she's going to be seen will be different. So that means that each locality have a way of socially constructing somebody's race. Okay, and this is important because this is the foundation, that it is this foundation, these ideologies that we use to then develop what we call racism. Now, I always jokingly ask the question, which one came first, race or racism? We don't have the time to indulge in it, but a lot of people think is race came first. I say no, racism came first. Racism is the ideology, is the thinking that one group is better than the other. One group deserves more than the other. And so in order to maintain, to justify racism, this idea of race was created. Now, to come deep down now to look at Ireland, how does racism play out? People, I get arguments like, oh, racism is new to Ireland. We don't have racism here. I'm like, actually, no, hold on. If we go back as far back as 1902 or 1903, we look at the Limerick program, right? When the Jews came to Ireland, what happened there? We did not accept them. We did not welcome them. Many of them had to leave again. We go back to 1954, when the Hungarians came to Ireland. They came as program refugees. We accepted them as program refugees in Ireland, right? But what did we do? We incarcerated them in a prison, in the barracks. We incarcerated them in the barracks. They actually had to go on hunger strike to protest, right? What happened when we even came to, when we look at, in 2004, what happened? Everybody you could be born in Ireland and be a citizen. But what happened? We had a referendum to say that, if you're born here, you're no longer entitled to be a citizen, So we have all of those things. And we have our own quintessential, racisms, where, as in Ireland, right? Because we were discriminated. I mean, the Irish were discriminated against in Ireland. They were, they had problems, with the British. When they went to America, they were enslaved, they were indentured servants and all of that. So people think, oh, Ireland has gone through all of that, so we can't experience racism. But what I'm trying to show you is that even though Ireland were discriminated against the Irish, that we too came to a point where we became white as Irish people, and we too then began to perform our own levels of racism. And this you can see. And the last one I will talk about is we see that so clearly with our asylum seekers. Again, there are people who've come here to seek protection, but what have we done? We've incarcerated them. And in 2003, what have we done? We've created 2 tiers. Now we have 2 tiers of asylum seekers, one group treated differently from the other. So we can see how racism, goes through, that it is in our systems, systemic racism, that within our systems, and that it is there, it exists.
Lots of food for thought there. Thanks very much, Evan. Emer, you grew up in Wicklow. Could you give the audience an idea of your lived experience with racism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel, I actually only started my journey in all of this 3 years ago. Dr. Eben has a lot on me in terms of understanding of, like, I hate to say it, but getting people on board. It's a long journey, and it's a journey that, like, a lot of people that are here are activists, are part of. Things where you suffer burnout. And when I look at Ireland as a whole, and I think about my Ireland when I was born in 1985, I can't help but keep having this come through to me. And that is, as a country, Ireland, we're in our infancy of understanding racism. And I'll say that again because I think it's really powerful. We're in our infancy of understanding. We're just newborns trying to understand really the complexities that are within racism within Ireland. And I say in Ireland because a lot of the time our Irish understanding of racism has come from so many other countries. My understanding growing up as a child of racism was coming from other countries, but I actually didn't really understand that. And that's something I think I want to hit on, just, being born in Ireland to an Irish mother, and having really zero influence from my African culture whatsoever. My mum was a single parent, a nurse. I started in a council house with my mum, just the 2 of us, and the racism that I experienced started from day one. Like, our house was robbed, we were burned out, it was flooded. My mum, when she'd leave the house, was targeted. I was called the N-word. She was an N-word lover. Like, that's from day one, before I even understood what racism was or why it was. And even at 18 years old, leaving Ireland to go to America, because I played basketball. I played basketball for Ireland since the age of 12. And I got a scholarship to go to America and play. And I went and I left and I went to Mississippi. So at 18 years old, directly after leaving cert, I set sail and went to Mississippi on my own. And it was through my experiences in America, in Mississippi, that I garnered an understanding of what racism was. I was never educated on the understanding of that or what that was here in my own country. And I think what's striking for me is that I now have a 9-year-old who is half Jamaican, a quarter Nigerian, and a quarter Irish, growing up in the same school system as me, 35 years later. And I'm seeing similarities in the things that he's experiencing in school that I did when I was growing up 35 years ago. That is, I think, one of the most troubling things for me. And I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. I graduated in the States with a teaching degree. And I've been teaching for 15 years, but I stopped teaching, and I've dedicated the last 3.5 years of my life to this work and understanding it myself. And I think that's really one of the things. Is like every day I'm learning, every day I'm understanding more of the nuances of being Black and Irish, or as Dr. Eben said, not being really either, which is, and she mentioned this, and you like that race, it is socially constructed, and it's a confusing thing for me, and has been a very confusing thing for me, in terms of understanding my own identity and who I am and where I fit. Because in Ireland, as Dr. Eben said, I am Black. But when I went to Nigeria with my dad for a visit when I was 15, I was white. When I was in Ireland, I was stared at because my skin was darker, my hair is different, I was different. When I went to Nigeria, I was stared at because, again, my dad would say, they don't, I'm in his small village in a Tukpo, where my great grandmother, I meet my great grandmother who's 105 with cataracts in her eyes and, no electricity in their home. People don't look like me. So the understanding of who I am and my identity was very difficult. And then traveling to the United States and living there for 10 years and realizing that I actually am too Black to be white, but I'm too white to be Black. And like, that's a bomb. I'll say it again, we are in our infancy of understanding what racism is. And with the changes in our demographic as a country, we will learn, and we have to be so open to it. But honestly, the only way that we're going to learn is if we open up these conversations to the people with the lived experience. And I think it's one of the things I just said to Jane Ann there was, I'm not used to having a say on any of this stuff. I'm used to listening to other people that don't look like me or have my lived experience tell me what's going on. That's what I'm used to. I really am. So this is new to me, where I'm given a space and someone says to me, how do you feel, Emer? Like, what have your experiences been? Or what's your advice? And I'm trying to come to terms with that. And every time I speak on it, and Eben will say the same, there's a heavy weight there because you hope that you do it justice every time, and that you will motivate people to want to understand that more. Because if you are a person who, is interested in human behavior and the effects of like situational things and environmental things on, mental health and success in life and all of those things, it's a very interesting thing that we have here in Ireland. A huge change, because it's only happening, it's new for us. Even when you look at international sport, when I was playing basketball for Ireland, I would have been one of the only people of mixed race playing back then. I recall, in fact, being away at a tournament, European Championships in Portugal, and my coach being asked for my passport. And I get it, yeah, because that was weird. But if you look at Ireland of the 21st century, if you look at our international athletes, the diversity, you can't ignore it. And there's so many things, I suppose, even within that, in terms of work that we need to do to ensure that we're safeguarding that and the understanding moving forward. I'm going to stop there, but I hope that was enlightening in some way, shape or form.
Emer, thank you so much for your openness, and what you're saying makes absolute sense. I want to turn to the NGO sector because, as Ronan was saying earlier, we have an important role in influencing the mindset of people and through our communications. Eben, I'd like to hear from both of you on this question, and it's basically, could you give me your reflections on how the images and messaging that are used by the overseas NGO sector, how does that impact on Irish society overall?
Thank you. And thank you, Emma, for sharing, that again, and you just, see how that, and that's one key thing that, that people who have a lived experience, it's not a Google search. When we talk about race and racism, it's not a Google search, and that's, if you really want to learn, that's where to learn from, and we keep saying things are nothing for us without us. That's the way it has to be done for you to actually get the real stories, to learn, to understand, all of that. And so when we look at, the kind of imagery that is used, I mean, honestly, like I see some of those images. I was born in Nigeria, I have never seen that level of poverty, like, that is shown. Like sometimes you see people like with flies, on their body. I'm like, Jane Marcus, I lived in Nigeria for how many years? 30 years, and I so you see that, like, you just see something, but it sends an image, it's sending something, it's sending, that image of just pure poverty that is being seen. So I'm saying that, so are we saying then that, right, that the people we're trying to get to give, to support these causes, are we saying they are so inhuman that people have to be really in this dying position to be this bad for them to support? Because that's what we're saying. Are we saying that we have to manipulate people to support? Because that's what we're saying. Do you understand? So because this is what Chimamanda called the danger of a single story. We use that single story. For example, let's take Ireland. Like Ireland, we were indentured servants, in Ireland. We had the blight and the potato famine. Do you know there are some Irish children, black and whites together, who don't even know that the Irish were ever indentured servants? Some children don't even know that. Do you know? So that's not the story we go about talking about Ireland. So why is it that, when we then want to look for support for these countries, we use such images that are so derogatory, so racism inducing? Because you look at racism, how do we learn racism? I don't think there's ever anybody who takes a child and say, you know what, I'm going to teach you how to be racist. It doesn't happen. So, but images like this is how we begin to learn racism. This is how we begin to learn stereotypes, because they come to fit the stereotypes. For example, in Ireland, we have this image of the black babies, so which, that's the container, the container, where we collect the boxes where they collect the pennies for, for children. And, so some people, until they were 40 years old or 30 years old, that was their only image, their only understanding of people of color. So imagine what it has created. It has created an image in them of people that you can name, people that, are so poor, So when they actually then met the real black people, you are an equivalent to that box. So that image of poverty, that image of not being a person, that, being objectified is what people then get. So it's really, really important that those images, unless we want to continue to maintain the images or the stereotypes, maintain the racisms, all of that, because that's exactly what it does. It ends up creating people who are very paternalistic. People, we create what we call white saviors. I don't know if you understand what we mean by white saviors, but what it ends up doing is that we end up creating people who are like white saviors. Oh, I'm going to save these people. So no, there's, just the way there's poverty in Africa, there's poverty in Europe, there's poverty in the United States, there's poverty in Ireland. Again, we're talking about housing. We have people who have died on the street from poor housing. So, so all of these things, we have all of these things in all of these places, but these images are so important because, number one, it reinforces a stereotype, and that stereotype then means that we permit people to continue to perform racism. Those are the images that continue to maintain, and reinforce this whole idea of, stereotypes. Again, like it creates images that people cannot, that doesn't create any form of respect for the people. Sometimes even these images are used without even getting permission. We don't even take permission from the people before using them to say, oh, this is how your image is going to be used. So again, so all of those key things. So it's really important that it has an impact, not just on the person, but on the economy, So again, we see that because you have diminished or demeaned the people, even the products, their education, everything that comes from them is also demeaned. And that is the extra part, that even when they come here in the diaspora, they are still treated as the containers, those same boxes, so that it has a long term. It begins to create what you are trying to solve. By solving problems of poverty, you actually end up creating generational poverty for the same people.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Evan. I think what you said, you know, the quote from Shimananda Ngozi Adichie, the danger of the single story is really, really cautionary for all of us in this sector. And I think things have improved a lot over the last few years, but obviously there's more work to do. Emer, your reflections on how our images and messaging affect those.
Well, I want to comment about the imaging in terms of, you know, black babies and flies and mud huts and that, because I grew up with that. So in school, when we would be raising money, you know, I'd be given that little box, the troker box or whichever, and I'd be given that to take home. And on that would depict black children with flies in their eyes and living in mud huts. And again, like, that would have been my first introduction to what like black people are, or my understanding of what black people are. I have something that I feel is special in the fact that I grew up thinking that I was just like everyone else. Like, I grew up thinking I was white Irish, you know, until very early, and I mean like as early as like 6 and 7, I started realizing there's something about me that's different. And then, you know, really investigating that as time went on. So when I would learn about people that were black or from third world countries, I was learning the exact same way as my peers. And my perspective of what that was growing up was poor, uneducated, needed our help, the poor black babies. That was the messaging. But then come to realize then that people, you know, would ask me, you know, like, is my dad and my granny and my ancestors, like, is that how they live? What's it like, Emer? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I've never been. Like, I'm living at home with the same mammy that you are, that's going mad because I left the immersion on. Like, I couldn't tell you, you know what I mean, what any of it's about. But I was directly affected by that imaging, unbeknownst to myself. And I garnered my own ideas and concepts about blackness and black people. And I grew up with that. And I'm still trying to kind of break down the systematic racism that is ingrained within me against myself that I didn't even know I had. You know, that is the cause of a lot of trauma for me, trying to break that down. And I think that's one of the really important things that we can take from these conversations, because we don't really know what it looks like. If there were more people like me back in 1985, I think our health system, mental health system, we'd be in trouble, because you wouldn't be able to provide for thousands of me's, you know, that have this trauma from, you know, the idea of imaging and messaging. And imaging and messaging is so important. Like, I'm sure you know this, but maybe people will be shocked, but like, my son last year, no, sorry, it was 2 years ago, came home to me. He looked at me, he looked weirdly at me, and he handed me a box that was flattened that I had to make. And lo and behold, that box was the same box that I had when I was a child to raise money for the black babies. And the imaging on that was the same 2 years ago. I kept it. I couldn't believe it. What do I do with that? What do I say? This is still happening. Oh my God. This is still happening. And my son is looking at me because he's darker skinned than me. That child that he sees on that box looks exactly like him. At least I could say, well, my skin's lighter. Or people could say, that's not you because you're not that black. He looks exactly like that kid on that box. And he's looking at me, not saying anything. I have no idea what to say. This is not in the parenting manuals. Like, I don't know. I'm not even educated enough to know what's the right thing to say here. And I asked him, are you okay? And he just looked at me and he said, yeah. But I just want you to imagine for a second, and those of you with kids, or those of you that were kids, which is all of us, what that must be like for him to sit at school and have this box passed out to him and his peers and people looking at it and looking at him, because you better believe that that happened. That looks like Kai, the only black child in our class. Is that the way? Was he like that? Is he like that? Are his grandparents like that? And it all goes back to, and I understand the goal. The goal is to incite empathy in people and want to help and ultimately to get help. But it's not the way. That messaging is, that's fake news. It's not that that's not happening or that there aren't places like that. Of course there are, yes. But that's not what the continent of Africa is or stands for. Like, I didn't know this until I was in adulthood nearly, like, but the amount of money in the continent of Africa, the wealth of black people and the education. And in fact, here in Ireland, those of African descent here in Ireland, you know, are generally statistically the highest educated in our country. We don't know that, and we don't talk about that enough, and that's not in the media. The unfortunate part of that, though, is that that same community that is so highly educated are one of the communities in the country that have the highest rate of unemployment. Help me figure that out. The sad thing is, you know, we're not using the assets that we have in our country to help us move forward. And like Dr. Eben has been talking about this, I'm just trying to figure out probably 20 odd years, I'm sure more. I'm doing this for 3 years, but I've been banging on about the same thing for 3 years. What happened in Dublin, I knew something like that was going to happen. A lot of people knew something like that was going to happen, but I was still shocked when it happened. But I hate to go back to it, but you kind of say, this is exactly what we've been saying. If we don't start, you know, decolonizing our curriculum, if we don't start accepting the fact that it's completely Eurocentric and we are not investigating and teaching our children about the global South, Indigenous people, etc., this is the exact thing that happens, because there's a lack of education, a lack of understanding, a lack of want to understand or to find a sameness with people that look different to you. You know, curriculum is huge, and work with young people is huge. Sometimes I say I want to throw my hands up to the air and say I'm done working with adults. I'm just going to focus on kids because they're the future. And honestly, when I do my workshops at schools, when I come out, I am full, because believe it or not, they get it. They have an openness and a kindness that is still there, that a lot of us, because of our life experiences and the influences that we're surrounded by every day, the media that we're being brainwashed with every day, with the same message. And the consensus of that message for centuries has been that people with white or pale skin are more educated, you know, and in general just superior to those with darker complexions. It has been beaten into us. It's been beaten into me, and I've believed it for a long time, and I'm trying to kind of get through that. But children are not affected by that just yet. They don't see that, and Dr. Evans spoke of that. And it's one of those things, you know, hate, you are not born with it. It is something that you are taught. You learn it, whether it be from your surroundings. And we talk a lot about environment and parenting, but we have to hold ourselves accountable as organizations as well, right? Our imaging and what we're teaching. Because who actually taught me that black people were poor and malnourished and uneducated? Organizations. And who are still potentially, you know, in control of that education and sending those messages. So they are vital. It's a reflection that a lot of us need to do, but you can't do those reflections alone. You have to have people with lived experience with you. And it's not that I want to be in control of any of it. I just want to help, and help any way possible. to get there and to help us as a country get there. Because I can see as an adult the damage that the lack of education and growing up in a system that is giving you that type of imaging that you're not good enough. And that in order to be good enough, you need to have straighter hair, whiter skin, different shaped nose, different body. I know what that years and years of that does to you in terms of, you know, your self-love, your self-esteem, your mental health, your confidence, your ability to succeed in life. Wearing my hair out in its Afro natural state, I talk about it. It can seem very insignificant to people. I was 35 before I started wearing my hair out in its natural state. 35 years old. Before that, I used chemical straightening since the age of probably 7 or 8. No, sorry, probably more like 8 or 9, to try and accomplish the goal of European standard of beauty. Because that's what I was told. That's what I see my imaging on my TV, in my books, throughout my curriculum, throughout every aspect of my life. And those things are unattainable for me. I will never have straight hair. I will never have white skin. I will never have the same body or nose as what I'm being told I need to have in order to like myself. And that's where that imaging becomes so important.
Thank you so much, Emer. Really, really open. And I think we feel as a sector we probably have a good understanding of racism, but I think even just with everything you and Eben are saying today, you're already challenging us to think differently. So Eben, I want to turn to you for a second. I've been listening to your podcast interviews over the last few days, and you talk a lot about the concept of racial stratification. Could you explain to the audience what that is, and then how it might be relevant for our sector?
Okay, thanks. Again, and Ima, just to buttress just some of the points that Ima raised, that this whole idea of Black studies and, Black History Month actually started in the United States to tackle exactly the same thing, that our young people in the United States were going to school and they were learning a history about themselves that was so negative that the children actually protested and said, you know what, you need to teach us our history, and that's how Black History Month started. And that's how Kataji Woodson, we call him the godfather of Black history. That's how he started, in Black studies as a learning group. And actually, in the United Nations has actually mandated by Resolution 13, that Black history must be taught in schools. That was part of the plan for the decade, that it must be taught in schools. There's nowhere where it's being done. We've been advocating for it. I started the first Black studies module at university level in UCD. It took a protest, for it to be taught in a second university. So again, we see all of those things, that there is no real interest in making the changes. Racial stratification, again, I write about it. I have a book about it, and I've written articles about it. Racial stratification is a homogenizing system of structured inequality. And what happens there is that an assigned default starting position determines the access to scarce and desired resources based on the person's racial grouping. So what all that definition means really is that there is a racial order in our society. Because how do we know that? Because whether you are in London, whether you are in Dublin, whether you are in Lagos, whether you are in New York or New Jersey or in Paris, the same people appear at the bottom of the ladder and the same people appear at the top. And in my research, I actually wanted to know, why is that? Why is that? There must be something wrong with these people. If they are everywhere in the world, they are at the bottom of the ladder. There must be something wrong with them, or there must be a system by which people know to position them at the bottom. And so my research began to see that there is a racial order, that people have a default starting position. So most times our research tells you where people end up, 50% in employment. But my research says actually, no, that is not where people end up. It is about where people start. So in other words, if you're us, so if you are white, Irish, you're us, you start at the top of the ladder. If you are like us, you are maybe Spanish, German, UK, you start in the middle of the ladder. If you are almost like, almost like us, you are Eastern European, you start lower than those who are almost. Then if you are other, if you're black or brown, then you start at the bottom. Now, that is a racial order. So everywhere in the world, that racial order exists. And this racial order is a default. So when you come into a place, when they don't know you are Dr. Ebun, they put you at the bottom of the ladder. If you like, dress nicely. You come into a meeting, they say, oh, sorry, can I give you my coat to hang up? Why? Because they assume that you're there as the cleaner. They don't want to assume that you are the keynote speaker. They assume you are there as the cleaner. So it's a default starting position. And that default starting position means that for you to achieve the same result as those at the top, you have to work 1, 2, 3, 4 times as hard to achieve the same result as those who are seen as the us at the top of the ladder. Now, why is this information important for those who are in your sector? It is important because not only are those people who are positioned at the bottom of the ladder at the bottom, everything that comes that is associated with them, their language, their food, their education, even when the education is gotten in the Western world, so long as it is one within that body, their education is minimized and diminished to the bottom of the ladder. So that's why you can see that, in Ireland, pre-COVID-19, when unemployment rate was only 5 to 9%, for Black people, unemployment rate was 60%. And this is a group who are saying that is highly educated. So again, I've written about that. Read my book or read my articles, and you can find that there, because we only have such a short time, to talk about this. So why is it important? When you continue to perpetuate such kinds of imagery, you are actually reinforcing the positioning at the bottom of the ladder, so that it becomes almost impossible for them to navigate out from that bottom. And so that comes to reinforce, to reaffirm that, so all their education, so whether the education is gotten here in the Western world, in a place like Ireland, or whether it is gotten from the Congo, so long as it is one within a Black body or within the African continent, it is diminished and minimized. When their products come from there, so you can find out that even though we know that cobalt, more than 70% of the cobalt that we need is coming from Africa, but what are we paying? We are not paying the minimum wage. We're not paying minimum wage for those things. We are paying less than. Look at the cocoa that we use to produce chocolates, right? The person who brings it out gets less than 3 cents, of that 0.3 of what is gotten from the cocoa, compared to the Western world that gets all the funding for that. So you can begin to see that even the products that come from there, the education of the people that come from there, that people, even whether in Africa or in the Western world, they are still diminished and minimized, in spite of they are not treated as, as they appear, as their abilities. They are treated as the stratification, where they are stratified at the bottom of the ladder. So it's really important that unless we want to continue to reinforce that negative imagery, and that's why it's almost impossible to actually deal with racism, because this imagery, this systemic form of racism continues to perpetuate. We don't know the impact of this imagery. Again, when I do my trainings, I talk about it. For example, you will see there was a H&M that did one of the adverts they did the last year. It was out in public, and when they did t-shirts, King of the Jungle, while the other one was so you can see those kind of t-shirts. He was a monkey, to a Black boy and a white boy. One was a monkey, the other one was an expert. The white boy was the expert, while the Black boy was, the jungle monkey. So those kind of imagery, even from companies, what are we doing? We are reinforcing that negative stereotype, and it becomes impossible to break from.
Thank you so much, Eben. We do want to allow time to hear from everyone who's on the webinar. Emer, just before we go into the breakout rooms, I wonder if you could give us any insights or thoughts on how NGOs could proactively address racism.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so policy is really important. And as you said, Sarah, at the beginning, I've written an anti-racism schools policy. I started a group, Brave for Love, and it was with a colleague from Brave for Love. We came together to do this. And I did it 3 years ago, and I have been trying for the last 3 years to ask the Board of Education or somebody to try and mandate that every school has an anti-racism policy. And you will find reference to racism under anti-bullying in a lot of places, including probably whatever organization that you work for. But what's very important is that we need to ensure that racism is seen as its own standalone piece. It needs the time and research and dedication necessary. That I'm going to just use schools as an educator here as an example, that should not fall underneath bullying. It needs to be its own entity. It needs its own research and its own data. And to make change across the board, you have to have data, you have to have research. That's what motivates change. But right now we don't have those things. One of the things that I tried to express with Minister Foley and her advisors is that we need to get data. The way to get data is, within schools and services that are used in schools where we document behavior. VSware is one that Irish schools across the board generally use. And on that, is where you put in issues of discipline. That we use that same software to be able to, differentiate between what's bullying and what's racism, so that we can go to individual schools across Ireland and gather information. I'll be able to see how many incidents of racism have occurred in this school year, what type of things they were, who it affected, and what was the outcome in terms of, consequence for the perpetrators, and also support and guidance for the person who was targeted or involved in those things. We need to have policy in place and mandated so that we can get this data. And it's a way of gathering data that won't be costly either, because all schools have this. And I feel that NGOs are the ones that need to push this. It took me 2 years to get in touch with Norma Foley to talk about my policy. And it's what it is it's a framework for people. You don't have to use my policy, but it's a framework, because when I set out to write that, there was nothing for me to use. I had no Irish resources to use to help me write that. I had to go to New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and America and pull things. There were no, 6.0 of, the Irish Teaching Council's, resource online that I can pull up to use to write this. And that's a problem. There should be. Those things need to be part of policy and standard documentation within education for us to be able to use that going forward. But the policy is there. What I've completed is to help people form their own around that, because it is a mammoth thing to go forth and design yourself. But at least if you have a skeleton to go by, it takes away that barrier that tells us, oh, this is too much. I'm not ready. I'm not educated enough. I don't have the help. We don't have the money. We don't have the resources. We don't have the time. And it's something that I suppose, even if this is one thing from today from me that you might take, would be this. And if you would like to help me work on this, next year is something I really want to dedicate my time to, providing this on websites for people to be able to take for free and use in organizations as well, because it's the same idea. Anywhere that happens, I think, need policy in place to protect those people that are affected by these things as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emer. I think, the idea of an anti-racism policy for the NGO sector makes perfect sense. So just really useful insights from both of you and very thought-provoking. I'd like us to go into breakout rooms now. We'll have 15 minutes and there's 3 questions for you to consider. So the first question is basically just what's your initial reaction to what you've heard today, your initial reaction. The second question is, how do you think the sector should move forward on the issue of anti-racism? So how should the sector move forward? And are there any immediate steps that can be taken by organisations? So Ronan has just put up the questions in the chat there. So just 3 questions, and we've 15 minutes. So we'll come back just after 11. I think Ronan is going to put us into the breakout rooms now. Okay, great. So you had 3 questions for discussion, and I'm just going to actually see, does anyone want to volunteer from room 1 on your initial reaction to what you've heard today? If we've no volunteers, I'm going to call on someone. So Paul Donoghue.
Hello. We were group 5, so I was expecting a bit more time.
Sorry about that.
Well, I think we jumped straight into some of the thornier stuff, which was that we understand that there is a tension between our goals and the impact it can have on people living in Ireland. And it's really important that as Ireland becomes more multicultural, and we talked about how the fact that it's really changing at pace, and it's great to see that Ireland is becoming like a typical modern Western European country. It has a multicultural society, and we don't want it to reproduce lots of the mistakes that places like England and France have made, you know. So everything all the efforts to move in the right direction are completely welcome. But overseas development and NGOs have a role, and that role is to try and alleviate extreme poverty and react to humanitarian disasters in different places across the world. And by default, then we come into the conversation when we're trying to make a difference in a place where things are pretty bad. And so that kind of reality of our work might be at loggerheads with the type of messaging that people think is helpful to hear in Ireland. But we're set up that way. So we're not in the business of saying, look at how, you know, businesses are booming in Lagos. Like, someone else does that. Someone else has that role to play. We're unfortunately in the business of going, right now in northeast Nigeria, there are hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced by Boko Haram violence. You know, that's a story from a couple of years ago, but that's kind of the story we tell. And then we go into the realities of people who are struggling at their kind of worst moments in life. So, and we've talked about how we have a responsibility of bearing witness, because we want the world to act. But that is attention. And so, you know, some of the stories talked about by Dr. Eben were interesting to hear a perspective on. You mentioned the reality of cocoa plantations in West Africa. And, you know, I've worked on talking about the exploitation of child workers in Côte d'Ivoire, for example. And how is it possible to talk about the story of a child who works without pay on a cocoa plantation without demonstrating this extremely poor scenario? And so we're just set up, unfortunately, to talk about places at their worst. However, the second half of our conversation, the second half of our messaging, is to show how we are making a difference, how we're improving, how we're in some material way making lives better. But there is kind of an expectation that we describe a problem first before we then going into the solution. And part of that kind of arc is to encourage people to give. And so there's this tension at the heart of it all that we struggle with.
Absolutely. I think that's it's really difficult to get the fine balance, and that's something we're working on all the time.
Can I respond to that, Sarah?
Sure, Emer.
Such a valid point, Paul. And like, realistically, across the board, no matter what it is that you're fighting for, you have to really emphasize the problem to be able to garner the support. But I think that in order to do that and have that message, you have to ensure that the people that you're pushing the problem to and putting it in such a bold manner, you have to ensure that the people that you're pushing that message to are educated enough to know that that's not an entire continent. And I think that's where probably the issue lies, is that like I would like to be able to look at seeing that imagery and saying, yeah, that is a huge issue, but I would like to be educated enough from childhood to know that, however, if I go to Lagos or Abuja or wherever, multi-million-dollar companies, luxury, everything's, there's money there, there's education there, that, you know, that I can at least know that there is that side of it also. Because I think sometimes the stereotype, it just takes over a whole community. And like, I think sometimes with messaging, that can be the main understanding of like an entire community. I don't know if that makes sense, or like if
it is. It's just the trickiness of whether we're the vehicle for the other side.
But like what I'm saying is, that's not your problem.
Yeah.
The education side is not your problem. What you're trying to do is help raise funds, awareness. That's not your problem to educate the country. That is where you push to help, you know, the government understand that your message doesn't work without educating the country. And it's not fair that, you know, as Irish people, we're not educated enough on understanding the layers of communities and understanding, you know, and trying not to necessarily stereotype everything.
Sorry, just not to take over, but one thing, sorry, Dr.
We'll
just bring in Evan.
And then we come back to the answers. No, just not from me. Do you want to take, because if not, we will miss out all the other feedback. So let's take all the feedback, and if we have time, we do because if not, we'll go back and forth. This is a volatile topic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we end up keeping those 4 others or 3 other groups not talking.
So just from one of the other breakout rooms, how do you think the sector could move forward on this? Does anyone from one of the other breakout rooms?
Hi, Sarah. I was in breakout room 2 with Alva and Andrew Campbell, Alva Joyce and Andrew Campbell. And I don't mind speaking. I can't see Alva.
Right.
So Andrew made a really good point of, we say, using the knowledge that's out there now. So kind of coming back to what Emer is describing there, using the knowledge in schools when implementing anti-racism policies, so that, in his words, all boats are lifting on a rising tide. I work for Trócaire, and my role is as the Early Years Development Education Officer. And part of my role is engaging with practitioners in early childhood settings, or undergraduates in third level colleges who are studying to be early childhood educators, and engaging them in learning about how to raise awareness of justice, equality, and global citizenship with young children. So this is kind of touching on Emer's point about starting when children are young, because I didn't have that when I was younger. I grew up in Ireland. I was born in 78. I grew up in the 80s, and the black babies were a reality for me. The Trócaire box was a reality for me. So that was what I grew up thinking was the normal for all people living in Africa. And that's really powerful to shake off as an adult, and even as a parent myself. So I feel that in my role in the early years, I'm some way challenging those perceptions by going out and engaging practitioners and student teachers in learning about how to challenge biases, by giving them, I feel, tools that we draft ourselves within the development education team. But yeah, it's going to be tough. I suppose I'm in my 40s now, and I'm still shocked by some of the things and some of the imagery I see that's being used to engage people in what is described as a politics of pity, when there's so many nicer ways that you could articulate how people can be enabled to function to the best of their ability in different societies around the world. But it's a learning experience, and I suppose that's why we have great organizations such as Dóchas that shine a light on use of imagery and how it can negatively and positively impact on society's wider view. It's
Great.
a learning curve for me, hands up. It's a learning curve, but they were just some of the thoughts to come from room 2.
Thanks a million, Colette. We don't have much time left, and I'd like to get some final reflections from Emer and Eben before we finish. So just if I could have another breakout room on what are some of the immediate steps that could be taken by organisations in our sector. Does anyone want to speak on that question? Claire, Mathias?
Yeah, so I was in was it room 3 maybe? I can't remember now. Well, we talked about how one of the first things we can do is to just get comfortable being uncomfortable. It's if it's our responsibility to accept some of the responsibility for how these images have and do affect people of diverse backgrounds in Ireland, we have to get comfortable with the criticism, and we have to fight any impulse to feel overwhelmed and to live in a state of inertia. We have to dig in. We have to really carefully audit our own materials. We have to think about this idea of a racism policy and how we could collectively as a sector have some commonality there, not just create things in a silo. So that might mean coming back to people from diverse backgrounds within our own organizations and outside to help us develop those in a way that is informed beyond our own internal viewpoints. So those are just some of the thoughts we had.
That's great. I think it's so true. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and actually our UK office in Concern took the lead on developing anti-racism guidelines, and they brought in a consultant from a diverse background, and they did have some of those very uncomfortable conversations, and out of it came the anti-racism guidelines, which we'll be promoting across the organisation. But thanks for those points, Claire. We've just 10 minutes left, so just if you do have a question for Eben or Emer, just put it in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Eben for some final reflections first.
Okay, just to say, am I mute? No. Just to say a real big thank you for being here and for the conversation. I think it's been a productive conversation, and just even the feedback coming from the rooms again. So it's interesting to see that you all engage with the topic, and and you really created some really good thoughts. Like the politics of PT. Again looking at all of those things. The impact of the Black babies. That's the foundation of the education that we actually get. And then we see one of the things I talk about is that in Ireland, even whether you are Black or white, if you go through our education system and you don't get anything different, you will end up with the stereotypes. You will end up performing racism because the system teaches you to integrate racism, into how we learn. So what do we need to do? So we need to come to a place where we call active unlearning, so that we look at, that the things, it's not, so most times we're trying to do anti-racism. I'm saying, okay, before you do anti-racism, there are some wrong things that we have learned. We have to unlearn it. How do we unlearn it? Again, we run modules, we run workshops on Black history. So you have to get Black history. Like when I teach you Black history, we look at things like, do you know that the first university in the world, is in Timbuktu? Do you know that, architecture, we can trace architecture back to Africa? Do you know that the 0 to 9 that we use is, gifted to the world by North Africa? When we look at medicine, legumes, so I can bring you to a view that changes the mind frame. And so that's what we call an active unlearning. So it shakes that wrong knowledge that we have. Do you understand? We look at even the map, the Mercator map is wrong. The geographical sizing is actually wrong. Do you know? So where the African is small at the bottom, actually that's not true. The geographical size of Africa is big enough to contain all of North America and Europe and Asia and all of, so we bring you to a place where you actively unlearn. We talk about slavery. People start learning about Africa from slavery. I'm like, no, that is actually wrong. Africa existed before slavery. Who were they? Then we take you on a journey to actually see Africa. Do you know that Ireland, we've not had a female Taoiseach? The United States, we've not had a female president. In Africa, the female leaders, the first part of the world that actually had female leaders and female queens and female presidents was Africa. Do you know what I mean? So again, we actually bring you on a journey that it changes, as we Africans we say, we scatter your dada, it just change the psyche inside the out. That's what we call an active unlearning. When you unlearn the wrong, then you begin to now put in the right. You begin to learn the right thing, and when you get only European history, of the world, you actually get half the story, and that is, is a danger that we talk about. So that's one key thing, is that active unlearning and to relearn the truth. And the second thing is, one of the things, which I will end on, is one of the things we've talked about is, add one. So for organizations that are on this call, we look at the unemployment rate of people of African descent. So it's a brain waste. People who are so smart, they've come from their countries or they are born here in Ireland, they have the abilities they've learned. But because of the, negative stereotyping, they are not in positions of power. They are not in positions, they are not in, if you look at the whiteness, even your organizations, I think all of the organizations here, all of them are very, very white. I won't mention which, but one of the NGOs actually interviewed me for, CEO position, for the NGO. I didn't make it through to any point. I said, but I am sure I would have done a much better job than any white person who is there. But, not that I want the job, don't get me wrong, I'm happy with my job, but I'm just saying that, that even when we go for the interviews, they find a way to just still get a white person in there, but you don't understand the challenges, the things, some of the mistakes that you make that won't be made, So if you look at the higher you go in your organization, the whiter it is, then you can do something. We have a campaign which we call Add One, that if you have, if you don't have Black people in your senior management, you should add one. Look for them, search for them, add one. If you have one already, add one more. It's that simple, and you can begin to make a change. Thank you.
Eben, that's a great message. Add one diverse member to your workforce. Just before I go to
one already, add one more.
Add one more. Just before I go back to you, Emer, I see Eilish Dillon is on the call. Eilish, you were very instrumental in the development of Dóchas' ethical communications guidelines, and you've been involved in academic research in this area for a long time. Just wondering if you had any reflections before I go back to Emer.
All right, thanks very much, Sarah. Sorry, I was trying to get in there for ages, so I missed a lot of the conversation following the groups. I was really interested in the two contributions earlier, really strong points that were being made. I guess the big challenge is, and it has come out in research that I've done, that many of you will be familiar with. The big challenge is really how NGOs take this on. The message, I'm not saying it's not new, but it is not new, actually. We know about the effect of global development representations on experiences of racism in Ireland and globally, and it is a global issue. And then I suppose the big challenge is, what do NGOs do about this? And the other point, I suppose, that came out very strongly in my research, and Eben mentioned it earlier on, is that this can't be about just Googling. It's not a tick box thing. It really has to systemically be taken on within organizations, decolonizing everything, and not just as a catchphrase, but actually addressing racism in terms of representations, the practices around gathering information, around sharing information, around representing broad development in humanitarian issues, and then looking at institutions and cultures and practices at very deep levels within organizations. It's very challenging, but it is essential. And I don't think it's something that can be just chosen. I think if NGOs are to be congruent with the values and the principles that are in the guidelines, but even more than that, anti-racism principles of equality and justice, they really need to take these issues on very seriously.
Right.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Eilish. Emer, we just have 2 minutes left, so some final reflections from yourself.
So the only thing I'm going to leave you with is, I was thinking last night, what would be a good hashtag to help people start you know, paying attention to the lack of diversity across the board in just general situations. Don't know if this works, but I came up with hashtag look closer. And the reason behind that, or to explain that hashtag look closer, the way I thought about it was, for me, when I go on to a website and I look at the staff or members of said organization, it automatically stands out to me that I'm not represented. And I see that without looking for it. I'm just, that's the way I am from growing up, knowing that I'm different. But I think what we need to do to get better at things is that we need to look closer. So if it's not on the forefront of your mind every day, which is understandable, like just, you know, the world. But if we go with this hashtag look closer, every time you're a part of something, when you go to a workshop, a panel discussion, you're on something like this, hashtag look closer. What is the demographic? What is the equality that you're seeing there? And I mean across the board, because it's as important to me that people with disabilities from, you know, other minority groups, that they're represented too. I see that. When I see myself not represented, I also see all of the other minority groups not represented. So hashtag look closer every day that you're involved in something. Where have we dropped the ball? And it might not be you or your organization, but when you spot it, call it out. Just pose the question. Like I went onto a radio station the other day. I wanted to see who their hosts were. I've been trying to break into media for the last 3 years. I just wanted to have a look at their hosts. White man, white woman, white woman, white man, white man, white man, white man. So I can see that straight away, but I want you to hashtag look closer, see that, and send a message to News Talk, to get onto the CEO and just say, guys, just an observation, I don't see much diversity in your team. Have a great day. Keep working hard. And do that again, and do that again the next time you see it, and do that again and again, and ask your friends to do that. Ask your friends, get in your WhatsApp group, say, guys, challenge you this month, hashtag look closer. What it means when you see things like that and inequalities happening, especially in big organizations that are setting the tone of who Irish people are, what they look like, what our culture is, call that out and ask them to look a little closer.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Emer. We all have a duty to call it out. I just want to say huge thanks to Jane-Ann and Ronan for hosting this conversation today. It's been a really rich, thought-provoking discussion. I feel like we've only scratched the surface and there's so much more we could talk about. And I'm sorry I didn't get to read all the comments in the feed, but really good comments coming in there. So I hope you've had a chance to read them. Ronan has recorded the conversation and it will be available on the Dóchas website. So please share it with colleagues who weren't able to make the webinar today. I want to say absolutely huge thanks to Dr. Eben and Emer for their insightful contributions, but also their very personal experience. And I think somebody said in the chat, if we don't hear these personal experiences, we don't sit up and listen and take action. What I also want to say is both Dr. Eben and Emer are available to come to your organisation, to work with you, to do workshops, to reach out to them. They both work as consultants, and they have huge expertise around inequality, around the labour market, around mental health, around obviously anti-racism. So huge thanks to Eben and Emer. And we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much, everybody.